Hello, my name is Matthew, and this is my very first oil painting. I painted it when I was maybe 13 or 14 years old. It's framed now. My mother framed it, and my parents are moving next month. And I visited what will be my old childhood home this morning, and everything's upside down. The boxes are out, things are getting moved around, and this painting had been a part of the household decor ever since I finished it. We had it framed, and my mom just had it up on the wall. And um, I saw it this morning, and I borrowed it, and I thought I would share it with you, show it to you, and talk a little bit um, about the painting and also some other thoughts about painting in general. This isn't the very first painting I ever did. It's my first oil painting. And I've shared this story before, but when I was in elementary school, um, visiting the library, I saw some art book, an art history book that had all of these fabulous paintings, artwork by um, all of the masters, all the famous artists that you can think of, and these wonderful images. The book that I had below would have a description of the artist and title, the size, and the medium. And um, just by chance or luck or anything like that, all of the images that I was looking at said oil on canvas. And I wanted to become a painter. I was already drawing and doodling, but I wanted to paint and I wanted to use oil paint. And it turns out that when you're a little kid, um, the materials that you need for oil painting are difficult to acquire. They're expensive. Um, you have to use things like either turpentine or mineral spirits or some alternative like a terpenoid. There's gels and mediums. It's a technical process. There's a lot to learn. The canvases are expensive. The kind of brushes that you need to use are more expensive than something for like maybe acrylic or tempera. And in school, I took all of the art classes that I could, but in a school setting, um, painting is either a very specialized part of the class, um, or just kind of avoided as much as possible. There's so much setup and cleanup that if a class is a 45-minute duration, um, just getting everything out and then cleaned up at the end takes up a lot of time. And in a class, you're most likely going to be using watercolor, acrylic, tempera, probably not gouache, but there's other kinds of paints that um, you might think are better for a young student to work with. Watercolor, in hindsight, now that I've um, spent years working in watercolor, it's an odd watercolor is an odd choice um, to be one of the first kinds of um, paints that children start with. It's fun and easy, but watercolor is by far the most um, difficult to execute well of all the different kinds of paints. Oil painting is forgiving. You can paint over it as much as you'd like. You can make all the changes back and forth, and no one would ever be the wiser. The same thing goes for acrylic. With watercolor, every stroke is permanent. You have these thin washes. You'll water down the pigment. Um, Professional or artist grade watercolors um, come in tubes, just like oil paint or acrylic, not in those plastic egg cartons. But you water down the pigment until it's diluted to just the thinnest veil of color. And you want to put down um, these washes, and it'll dry very quickly. You'll use watercolor paper, which is thicker. It has a high tooth, which means it's textured. And each time you reapply a new thin layer of watercolor paint, it reactivates um, every layer that you've had before. And so you have to be mindful of all of the layers, all of the colors, all of the depth and richness that you want to create um, in advance. That way it doesn't become muddy, which is very easy to do. I think everybody's experimented with watercolor, and it just very quickly becomes a muddy mess. You have less of that to worry about with oil paint or acrylic. It's at least correctable, which is it's not correctable with watercolor. So I had painted in watercolors and tempera and acrylic, and around 13, or I was maybe 13 or 14 years old, um, focused. I was drawing and painting every day, and we went out. My parents, um, we all went out and got some art supplies, and so this is on a canvas. Again, you're not going to be using canvases um, in a typical public school. They're expensive. You have to store them. And I don't know why I chose a rose. Hopefully you can tell that it's a rose. It's a rose from my mother's garden. I remember painting it. I don't remember the motivation um, for the image that I selected. And I'm still very happy with this painting. Of course, I can look at it now and see all of the flaws and things that I might think about differently now. But for a first go, I'm very happy with it. You can see some of the shortcomings. You can tell um, which pigment, which color paint I was using. So there's like the alizarin crimson here, the like a bright red cadmium. Um, just different colors you can tell are very specific right out of the tube. And the technique that I was using um, is called stippling or dappling. You go like this, and just like that, which isn't necessarily the best way of using oil paints. Oil paint, its main attraction, one of its best features, um, is that you can make very thin layers of translucent paint and build up these layers into incredibly rich colors and shades in a way that's very different, especially at the time that oil paint was invented, which before then was mostly temperas, and you had what they were using in the plasters for like frescoes. Now you could have these luminous colors. There was optical mixing, thin layers of translucent paint, and light is going through these layers, creating colors that you cannot mix on a palette. I wasn't doing any of that. I didn't know about any of that. I was just squirting out my tubes and going like this. And when I look at it, I think of when I think critically of what I would be considering now. Um, I mentioned the color differences. You can tell there's these specific shades. The way that I was making lights. So here you can tell there was um, a white color underneath, and I was kind of peppering. Um, there's pinks on top, and then other parts, like here, you could tell it was mixing. So this is um, kind of like pointillized bits of pigment that your eye puts together into like a nice bright pink. Down here, pink is a very difficult color to mix. It gets pasty and pastel, and it's never the color that you think of when you think of pink. And so I'm experimenting with just getting the job done, looking at each petal and figuring out I want to have that shade gradient, um, but a lot of it doesn't really make sense. Like there's like this triangle here. Where is that attached to the rest of the blossom? And kind of the shady bits, realizing um, I didn't know how to handle um, the the shades, the parts where the petals would come into those the cavernous portion of a rose blossom. And all of the edge work is not very well defined. Um, it's sort of a messy kind of painting. And this was either an alla prima or a two-session painting. Nothing that I labored over for days or weeks or anything like that. Again, oil paint takes so long to dry. You can use that and have days. Oil paint can take days, sometimes weeks, or depending on the pigment and the thickness, months to dry. So there's a lot of very important pondering that you can do. um, and I'm happy with the composition, but um, it's obvious that the background was not a consideration. I wanted to paint a rose, and then just sort of some background. For some reason, I chose blue, um, which, as far as perspective goes, doesn't really make sense because it kind of looks like I'm looking down on the rose. The blue's supposed to be sky, the sky. Like, none of that really matters as far as artistic license, but those are considerations that I think are important to make. I could very well paint today a rose that looks very similar and has a lot of the traits that I've gone over. The difference is I would be thinking about them and have some reason why I would want to have a blue background instead of a green background. Um, this little bit here is the stem. You could see I tried to do a thorn, so maybe I would do a blue background to have that little green part pop. And yeah, so it's a rose blossom from my mother's garden, my very first oil painting. Um, I'm not really sure how much this is. I don't know how interesting this is, but um, I thought I would share it with you. It's a very special painting for me, and um, and that's it. So thank you for watching. Please leave a comment if you would like. Let me know what you think of the painting, and that's it. So thank you. Please leave a comment, and take care.